Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us. Thanks to everybody who came in our in-person audience. Thanks to everybody who's watching from home on our YouTube livecast. My name is Jonathan Corrado. I'm the Policy Director here at the Korea Society. Today's program is called South Korea and a Regional Order in Flux. Before I get started, I want to thank the Korea Foundation and all of our corporate sponsors for making this program possible. As everybody knows in this room very well, the Republic of Korea inaugurated its new president, Yoon Suk-yeol, this week, providing us with a cause to examine shifts to Korea's foreign policy agenda and the forces that will influence its trajectory. To do so, we have welcomed an amazing cast of experts here today. Our moderator is the inaugural holder of the Korea Society's Van Fleet Senior Fellowship, Dr. Katrin Katz. Katrin is a former director for Japan, Korea, and Oceanic Affairs at the staff of the National Security Council. She also previously served with the State Department and with the CIA. She currently also serves as an adjunct fellow at the Korea Chair at CSIS down in Washington, D.C. Katrin, thanks so much for being our moderator today.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Next up, going in order of seating, is Dr. Andrew Yo. Thank you for joining us, Andrew.
Thanks, pleasure being here.
Andrew is a senior fellow and the SK Korea Foundation's chair in Korea Studies at Brookings Institution Center for East Asia Policy Studies. Andrew is also professor of politics at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. His latest book, State, Society, and Markets in North Korea, a good one, you should get your hands on it if you can, examines marketization in North Korea and its impact on state-society relations. If you're interested in that, check out our book talk on that book tomorrow morning. It will be live cast. And finally, we've got Dr. Patricia Kim. Thank you so much for joining us, Patricia. She is a David M. Rubenstein Fellow at Brookings and holds a joint appointment at the John L. Thornton China Center and the Center for East Asia Policy Studies. Patricia is an expert on Chinese foreign policy, U.S. China relations, and U.S. alliance management. Thank you so much for joining us, Patricia. Thanks to all of our audience for joining us both in person and virtual. While it's easier to watch this program virtually, there's benefits to coming in person. We've got lunch for you after the program, so stick around and enjoy that. Hopefully that serves as an inducement for some of our virtual viewers to come in person next time. You have an opportunity to send in your questions live and throughout the program. You could do that by emailing policy@koreasociety.org. We'll also have an opportunity for our in-person audience to ask questions at the end, so have those ready to go. You can raise your hand and we'll bring a microphone to you. So many of you have already sent out your audience questions, and we look forward to getting those at the end of the program. With that, it is my pleasure to turn the proceedings over to today's moderator, Dr. Katrin Katz. Katrin.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, for that warm introduction. To echo Jonathan, Andrew, and Patricia, we are so happy to have you here today to help us identify and analyze changes within the Indo Pacific order and their implications for South Korea and the alliance. Thank you for making the trip from Washington, D.C. to be here in person. I'd like to pause for a moment and just let that resonate. And it's really quite special to be here, three-dimensional people instead of on the screens. Of course, we also are happy to have our virtual audience members here and on the live audience as well. And a special thanks also to the Brookings Institution for sharing two of their star scholars with us today. I can't wait to hear insights on this topic, but I thought it might be helpful to provide a few general framing remarks regarding this general topic before kicking off the discussion. So not to be overly academic, but I think it's helpful sometimes to define some of the key terms and concepts that we're thinking about. So today it's South Korea and a regional order in flux. What do we mean by regional order in East Asia, and why is that important? So I'll kick it off with a couple of thoughts on that. As this very well-informed audience likely knows, as well as those joining us virtually, over the past nearly 8 decades since the end of World War II, the regional order in Asia has consisting generally of a combination of institutions, rules, values, and norms that guide countries' expectations. The particular order within East Asia has been characterized, and this is painting with very broad brushstrokes, by 3 components. What are those 3? Again, as many of you know well, one, a U.S.-led bilateral alliance system known as the hub and spokes system, which the U.S.-ROK alliance is an integral component of. Secondly, more informal, consensus-based multilateral initiatives in Southeast Asia centered on ASEAN, or the Association for Southeast Asian Nations. And thirdly, an open economic order that fostered rapid export-led growth in several countries, including Japan, South Korea, China, and others, as well as rising economic interdependence both within the region and with the world. So why is this important, this order? What are some of the things that's produced? I mean, this could be a topic in and of itself for a separate event. But one thing I think that's important to kind of note at the outset here is that many have noted how remarkable this era has been within this region, under this order, for the stability, peace, and prosperity it has produced when compared with the prior century, with some notable exceptions, of course, like Cold War conflicts in Korea and Vietnam. But generally, this has been a time of remarkable peace, stability, and prosperity. So in recent years, this regional order and patterns of interaction within it have undergone some significant changes, and that's what we'll be talking about today. To highlight one of the most obvious, its geographic scope has shifted. We now hear more about the Indo Pacific than the Asia Pacific. And so in order to unpack all of that and make sense of it for us, both where the orders come from and what's changed and what it means, I'm very happy to now start with our first round of questions. We'll start with casting a wide net and think broadly about identifying some of the most significant changes within the Asian/Indo-Pacific regional order in recent years, and what impact those changes might have on levels of stability and prosperity in the region for decades to come. So with that, Andrew, I'd like to start with you with a question on regional institutions. You have literally written the book on this topic. The title is Asia's Regional Architecture, Alliances and Institutions in the Pacific Century, was published by Stanford University Press in 2019, and I highly recommend it to any of you who haven't yet come across it. So your book maps out both continuity and change in the region's bilateral and multilateral arrangements over the past several decades and highlights different scenarios for the future. In recent years, as noted, we've seen a marked increase, particularly in the formation of new multilateral and minilateral institutions. So we know about the alphabet soup already existing in the region, organizations like ASEAN, ARF, EAS, APEC. I won't spell them all out today. We now have new institutions like RCEP, CPTPP, a mouthful always, AUKUS, and of course the non-acronyms, the Quad and the Quad Plus. So I'm curious, Andrew, to hear your thoughts on what these new institutions mean for the Indo-Pacific. Specifically, to what degree do they represent continuity or change in the regional order? And with what implications for future levels of stability and peace or conflict in the region?
Right. Well, thank you, Katrin, for those excellent framing remarks. And before I answer that, I just want to also say thank you to the Korea Society. This could have been billed a Brookings Meets Korea Society event. It's really wonderful to see a live audience as well too. So thank you again, and also to the organizers, to Irene and Jonathan. Getting to the question at hand about the regional architecture and regional order, I mean, if we step back, it gets this question about the role of institutions, whether they're bilateral alliances or multilateral institutions, and whether they provide stability or whether they're sources of conflict. When you ask this question about change and continuity, now I'm not going to I'm going to focus on the here and present in the Indo-Pacific, but if we look at this from a longer time frame, we have to think back to the post-1945 order. And if you think about the regional architecture then, and during the Cold War, it was really just the hub and spoke system that you mentioned, the U.S. bilateral alliance. That was the framework for institutions. But as you mentioned, today, there's this bevy of organizations and institutions, the alphabet soup. I know some of us have young children. You can use them on the refrigerator magnets to spell out CPTPP or RCEP. But that is a big change where you had this this vacuum of, there was an absence of institutions. There's an argument in the 90s that Asia was under-institutionalized, and because of the lack of institutions and these interconnections, interdependence, that the region was ripe for rivalry. But now we do see many institutions, and so the question we can ask again is the region more stable? Is it less prone to conflict because we have so many institutions? So to answer the question about changing continuity, yes, there has been change to the structure of this regional architecture. And we of course see continuity though, because the hub and spoke system, the bilateral alliance system is still in some ways the framework to which many of these new institutions, such as the Quad, hangs on. We also have the Association for Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, that became a focal organization, a central organization, and many institutions such as the ASEAN +3 or the East Asia Summit also built off of ASEAN. So we've seen change at the macro level, but I think the most important question here is where or what this means for regional order. If you were to ask me this question in the late 1990s, early 2000s, the answer would have been pretty simple. Usually when you think about institutions, this is intro to IR, IR 101, institutions is meant for cooperation. It helps lower transaction costs. It allows for easier coordination among states. So the assumption was that with the growth of institutions, with the growth of East Asian regionalism, with ties, economic ties with these stable institutions, that there should be more cooperation. I think there was a lot of optimism that the region was moving in a direction towards an East Asia community. But at some point in the late 2000s and early 2010s, and I think it really does track with this idea that China was becoming much more assertive, much more aggressive. That doesn't seem to be the case. And in fact, if you look at institutions now, some will argue that the growth of institutions like AUKUS or Quad, or in the China's case, they have the AIIB, there's the Shanghai Cooperative Organization, there's Chinese-led institutions. Many say that these institutions are just a manifestation of balance of power politics. That is, the institutions are growing, but they're growing in a way that reflects geopolitical competition, not really creating a condition that can lead to greater interdependence and cooperation. So on one hand, so to finally answer this question, what's it mean for the region? Yes, there's stability, but within particular orders, whether it's among U.S. allies and partners, or whether Patty can speak more to the China bit and China's partner organizations. That one might see stability in a community building being built there, but in terms of geopolitical fault lines, in some ways they may also be contributing to tensions and conflict.
Very interesting. Thank you so much, Andrew. And just again to mention the book, interestingly, and I've looked through the book, he kind of foreshadows this possibility of the bifurcation as one potential future scenario. As well as this idea that institutions breed patterns of cooperation and opportunities for countries to see each other who might not otherwise relate with each other. So even in 2019, it was things have really hardened since then. And I guess this is something we can think about for later. I guess one of the open-ended questions is the degree to which moving on down the line, especially perhaps in the economic sphere, there's possibility for overlap between, is it necessarily that the realists have won, or are we still in this space, kind of tic-tac in different analyses? I see a tic-tacking before these, still these two possibilities of overlap, with the institutions being a critical component of that for organizing regional interactions. So again, excellent work on this already, and I think Andrew will be a really important expert on this moving forward to kind of help us analyze what this means for future conflict and stability moving forward. So thank you for that great kicking us off, Andrew, with those great thoughts on institutions. Patricia, I would like to pivot a little bit, still casting a broad net here and thinking about big changes in the region, but I would like to get your thoughts on the impact on the regional order of another critical change in the region, which is another thing we're all quite familiar with, the intensifying strategic rivalry between the United States and China. So, Patricia, you have done some really interesting work recently on China's increased focus on building strategic partnerships in the region and beyond with countries like Russia, Pakistan, Myanmar, Cambodia, and Egypt, among others. This work is highlighted in your Foreign Affairs article from last fall entitled China's Search for Allies, which is also a must-read for those of you if you may not have seen it yet. So, Patricia, could you talk a little bit about what China's search for strategic partners has entailed and the capacity for this emerging China-led network to reshape the regional and global order as we know it? And then another kind of big question to tack on to that, if you could handle both. What impact has Russia's invasion of Ukraine had on China's efforts to build its own team, really, to face off with the United States and its allies?
Well, thanks very much, Katrin. I want to thank the Korea Society and Jonathan and Irene for bringing us here, bringing Brookings to New York City for this event. It's so wonderful to be here with members of the Korea Society in person and online. So there's a lot to unpack in your question, Katrin. And let me start by noting that as you and Andrew have both alluded to, the U.S.-led alliance network, including the U.S. ROK alliance, has always been a long-standing feature of the geostrategic landscape in Asia. And Chinese leaders, on the other hand, have traditionally shied away from seeking formal allies based on what they say is a distinct worldview and sort of position on international relations, and a very pragmatic desire in Beijing to avoid the risks of entanglement. But in recent years, and especially over the last decade under Xi Jinping's leadership, there's been a concerted effort by Beijing to upgrade its strategic partnerships and expand not just its economic and diplomatic ties, but also its military ties with key partners like Russia, Pakistan, and Iran. And it's been quite striking to watch Moscow and Beijing's growing strategic alignment in particular, given these two states considered each other their biggest rivals just a few decades ago. And their relationship today, which Chinese leaders have characterized as a no-limits partnership, is underpinned by this shared notion and grievances vis-a-vis the West, and these parallels that the two states see in their situations, with Russia accusing the United States and NATO as encroaching on its sphere of influence, and China pointing to the U.S.-led alliance network in the Indo Pacific region as doing the same. It's been very interesting to watch how Beijing has processed and reacted to the global outrage on the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the scrutiny that this has brought on Beijing as well, on what its role was in all of this and why it chooses to maintain a close relationship with Moscow despite what it's doing out in Ukraine. And while Beijing has disavowed any foreknowledge or role in Russia's invasion, and it said it's a neutral party, that it supports peaceful negotiations and so on, and it also hasn't gone out of its way to help Moscow evade sanctions, or it certainly has not provided direct military assistance to Russia. But at the same time, Chinese leaders have chosen to double down on their alignment with Moscow. They haven't distanced themselves. They have certainly not condemned Moscow's invasion of and violation of Ukraine's sovereignty. And top Chinese leaders have come out multiple times over the course of the several months to reiterate that the China-Russia relationship remains ironclad. And also Chinese officials and media continue to champion Russian talking points that basically wave away Putin's responsibility for what's going on and place the blame on the United States and NATO as ultimately driving the tragedies that we're seeing in Ukraine. So important question to ask is, well, why are they doing this? Why are they paying these deep reputational as well as economic costs to stand by Moscow? And first, I think the fact that Xi Jinping has invested personally in his relationship with Putin, the two leaders have met dozens of times over the last decade, certainly plays a factor in the inability of the Chinese system to sort of roll back on where they stand on this relationship. But more fundamentally, I think there's a strong perception in Beijing that even if it were to join in on Western sanctions or condemnation of Moscow, this wouldn't fundamentally improve China's relationship with the United States or with Europe, and it would simply leave Beijing isolated. And so I think China's policy choices around the Ukraine situation demonstrate that Beijing has become much more intentional and bolder about keeping its strategic partners close, even if this comes at a cost to its other relationships, like with the United States and with key Asian states like Japan or South Korea. And I think these decisions are being made in Beijing as Chinese leaders are looking around and seeing the strengthening of the U.S. alliance network in the Indo Pacific region, the growth of the Quad, AUKUS, and other initiatives, and they're really scrambling to draw their friends closer. And of course, this has deep implications for regional and global stability. For instance, on the Korean Peninsula, I think a China that's more interested in keeping Pyongyang on its side rather than using its influence to try to push North Korea to the negotiating table or to put a halt to North Korea's continued expansion of its nuclear and missile program doesn't bode well for the Korean Peninsula in finding a way to denuclearize and work towards peace. Also, China's new security pact in the Solomon Islands is another case in point. While most of the attention on this deal has been on the potential for China to establish a base in this Pacific nation, I think just as alarming, perhaps even more alarming about the deal is the fact that China has essentially promised Honiara, the capital or the regime that's in power in the Solomon Islands, to help it keep internal security. It has promised to dispatch its own armed police and military troops to the island to keep internal stability, which really, raises the question, is China entering the business of militarily propping up friendly regimes? It certainly wouldn't be the first great power to do so, but I think this could be a game changer, and it's hard not to imagine Beijing extending such an offer to North Korea at some point. Whether North Korea would accept that kind of arrangement is another question, but you could see this sort of division in the region really unrolling. And so, I fear that we're seeing the return to some of the really destabilizing dynamics that we haven't seen since the Cold War, with the rise of two rival blocs that are locked in ideological competition and contending for partners. And this has significant implications for the United States, for South Korea, and the broader region.
Wow, thank you so much. Great insight and knowledge from that. Just thinking back to this hub and spokes alliance that Andrew noted is still there, still very important. For many years, Beijing was outside of that, and it was a bit of a holding pattern. Didn't necessarily like it, but was still, saw some benefits from the stability of it, right? And cooperated from time to time on places like the six-party talks in North Korea. And Patricia's comment just made me think how quickly, particularly Russia-Ukraine, has catalyzed a new kind of role for Beijing in its partnerships in this bifurcation. And just case in point, not helping out in the United Nations with sanctions after North Korea's recent provocations, and how quickly that's happening. Both of you have brought great insight to that. Another kind of open-ended question, though, for this is, what does this no limits partnership mean that isn't an alliance, right? Using some of this really strong alliance-like language, but they're not actually, going to go, they've never declared they go to war for each other, right? As you've noted, they've been rivals recently. It's, they have a very complicated relationship. So I'll just say this to, again, watch Patricia's work in the coming months, because you certainly have the expertise to help us unpack these lingering uncertainties in this space. So thank you both for this really great, start and thinking about these two major shifts in institutions and in terms of Beijing's partnerships. I'd like to shift to a second round of questions. After this, I have one more round, and then we'll get to audience questions, which I really look forward to. But for the second round of questions, I'd like to pivot our focus to the implications of these shifts in the regional order for Korea, for the Korean Peninsula. So Andrew, starting with you, how do you think South Korea should best position itself within the evolving regional architecture we just discussed to maximize its opportunities and defend against threats? More specifically, should South Korea seek to join the Quad as a formal member? And by Quad, I'm referring to the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue comprising the United States, Japan, India, and Australia, which the U.S. really envisions as a part of a kind of networked security architecture. So a whole big topic in and of itself there. One big question that I'm just, throwing over to you, big one right now: should South Korea join as a formal member? Should the Yoon administration continue with the prior administration's new Southern policy? And just to note, this dovetails well with a question we got from the audience. Let's see, Charles Willow from Monmouth University, which is, what are Korea's diplomatic strategies in the Far East? Thank you for that question, Charles. And over to you, Andrew.
All right, thanks. So the irony about South Korea is that we, especially everyone in this room, we're here at the Korea Society, understands that South Korea is a middle power, that it remains engaged globally, that it wants to be seen as a global player. And maybe in the early 2000s, and this is under Kim Dae-jung, late 1990s, early 2000s, they were very involved in the whole East Asia community, East Asia regionalism process. So they were engaged with regional institutions. And this goes through up to the Lee Myung-bak period, so the early 2010s. But it's interesting that these days, when you talk to counterparts in Japan or in Australia, countries that we now see as part of this Quad, they really see South Korea outside of the regional architecture. I think part of it has to do with, because they're thinking about Korea as really with the strategic dynamics. So I was looking for my research in Japan's diplomatic blue book that they publish every year, and they have a section on Indo Pacific cooperation. Korea is not mentioned once in there. They mention India, Australia, Germany, France, UK, even the Netherlands. Korea is not named once. So they don't really see Korea as an Indo-Pacific partner. And I remember just talking with an Australian scholar, a policy strategist, and just asking, what is Australia's views about Korea? And he said, oh, well, they're kind of doing their own thing. They're sort of out there, but they're not really a part of the picture on the Indo-Pacific. Now, this is only one individual's perspective or opinion, but I think there's been a sense that South Korea has not really been quite as engaged on the Indo-Pacific front, and really for two reasons. This is by no means criticism towards I was going to say outgoing president, but now the former President Moon. Because he was trying to stay engaged with policies like the New Southern Policy, but I think because he was leery about going full swing into these new institutions that were part of the Indo-Pacific framing, that in some ways Korea was losing relevance, at least on the strategic front. So while it stays engaged with existing institutions like the East Asia Summit or the ASEAN +3, in reality, these institutions that centered around ASEAN have lost their luster as we see geopolitical competition rising. And we can get in, maybe in the Q&A, we can get into the reasons why the Moon government wasn't quite as sold on the Indo-Pacific narrative or the framing. But we do have a new president, so the Yoon government has been very clear that they want to engage this Indo-Pacific much more. And that gets to your question about the Quad, whether South Korea should join. Rather than answer yes or no, I think the first question we should ask is, do other countries who are members of the Quad want South Korea to come in? Would they be excited about Korea joining in? I think U.S., yes. Not necessarily as a formal member, but they certainly want to see Korea more engaged. I think Australia as well, too. Japan and India, well, it's got to be a little bit more circumspect. So we have the Quad, but I think the Quad itself is still building up, it's solidifying, and to suddenly add new members, I think it might be too early. That being said, I think all the Quad members would be open to South Korea becoming more engaged through their working groups. So there are different working groups within the Quad that address specific issues, like climate change, like supply chain resilience, COVID-19 vaccines, or space policy. These are all issues that I think South Korea can contribute to in terms of the discussions, in terms of regional policy. And so I do think we'll see in this upcoming summit meeting between President Biden and President Yoon, and then later on when Biden goes to Tokyo to meet with other Quad leaders, I think we'll see at some point the Quad inviting South Korea to take part in these working groups. And then we can go from there. Maybe down the road, the US and other Quad countries will think that it's time to expand this membership, and certainly South Korea could be a good contender. But so probably formal membership is not it's not going to happen anytime in the near future. But certainly we're going to see South Korea more engaged with this quad grouping.
Great. So another watch this space area with a critical change this week with a new president of South Korea declaring through his campaign that he's going to be a more active, South Korea will under the Yoon administration, be more active in the region in organizations like the Quad. That said, as Andrew noted, it's a really interesting area to watch because there are ongoing sensitivities for South Korea, even under this administration, with China and how China will respond to its membership. Another kind of thread from this that maybe we can pull in the Q&A that I think is fascinating is the region's view of South Korea is a middle power. It's not present. That comment about that the Australian person you were speaking with, I'm sorry, I'm blanking if you had the name, but a friend of yours in Australia saying they're not at the table. Such an interesting juxtaposition with the size of South Korea's economy, top 10 economy, a world-class military, and certainly on the soft power level. We all know, Korean movies, dramas, and music groups are really, punching at a global level, not above South Korea's weight, but truly at the level South Korea, should be. So this interesting juxtaposition in how South Korea views itself in the region as a player on these issues, as well as how the region is almost a misfit with the global view of Korea. We all know about Samsung phones, LG TVs. Within the region, it plays this different. So another kind of thread to maybe pull on later.
If I can make a 15-second interjection, China sees the Quad and the Indo Pacific narrative as really an anti-China type coalition that is trying to balance China. And so that was one of several reasons why I think South Korea was a little bit leery about jumping into the Quad. And so that's another reason why I think for the time being, South Korea itself may not necessarily seek formal membership, but the working groups may be one way around to not anger or aggravate China too much, but still become a part of this other alignment of U.S. allies and partners.
Thank you for that, because it's a perfect dovetail to Patricia's question. But really, watching what South Korea does within these institutions that, we kind of teed up in talking about their existence, but what South Korea does in kind of, weaving its new role will be really fascinating to watch. Okay, so for Patricia, as we just, it's a perfect dovetail because I was going to ask about the new Yoon administration. As you and others are surely aware, the newly inaugurated South Korean president, Yoon Suk-yeol, is poised to increase South Korea's role in upholding the rules-based regional order, has been quite vocal about this in his campaign, as well as in supporting the U.S. Indo Pacific strategy. So there's also been a lot of talk about how this is, as Andrew was noting in his comments, how this, there's sensitivities with China, how South Korea's increasingly assertive posture in the region is likely to spur new forms of pressure from China to tread carefully on issues sensitive to Beijing. So my question to you, and it dovetails with an audience question that I will mention as well, is what form do you think Chinese pressure on the Yoon administration might take? And how do you think Seoul should prepare for and respond to Beijing's tactics in the coming months? Just to note quickly, this dovetails well with a question from audience member Jeffrey Tao, who is a retired UN interpreter. Jeffrey asks, under the new conservative government in South Korea, are South Korea-China relations likely to deteriorate further? So over to you, Patricia.
Sure. So let me start by noting that I think the Yoon administration's calls for South Korea to broaden the aperture of its foreign policy so that it's not just narrowly focused on the Korean Peninsula, but it aims for a bigger region in the Indo-Pacific, or a bigger role in the Indo-Pacific region based on South Korean values and interests, and not to sit on the sidelines in deference to any outside power. These are all very laudable objectives. I think, however, balancing South Korea's many interests and expanding its regional and global role, especially when it comes to security issues, is not going to be an easy feat, and I think will come with real potential costs as well. So setting aside the China angle for a moment, it's not clear to me how much appetite there is actually in South Korea among the general public for this expanded role, especially when it comes to advancing freedom and democracy in the global arena. And this featured very heavily in President Yoon's inaugural address. But if you look at exit polls from the recent presidential elections in Korea, more than 50% of South Korean voters identified economic growth, job creation, tackling the real estate market as top priorities for the new administration. And then below those were needs for political reform and corruption, addressing corruption at home, strengthening social security, and dealing with pandemic-related challenges, and so on. And foreign policy priorities really didn't show up on any of those top priorities lists at all, which was very striking to see. So I think given this sentiment, there could potentially be a disconnect between the ambitions of the new Yoon government and political elites who want South Korea to do more in the regional and global arena, and this appetite for a more activist foreign policy versus the priorities of the general public. And I think this could especially prove to be true if and when Beijing decides to use coercive measures and probably most likely economic coercive measures to punish China for calling out Beijing on, for instance, violating human rights norms or issues or something like that. When it comes to the prospect for friction in the China-South Korea relationship, I see several looming issues. The Yoon administration has taken office vowing to further enhance the U.S. ROK alliance so that it could take on a more comprehensive agenda in the region, and for Seoul to actively engage with networked initiatives like the Quad and others that Andrew talked about in his remarks, and for South Korea to strengthen its deterrent capabilities vis-a-vis the ever-growing threat posed by North Korea. I think some key issues around these goals, however, that are bound to surface include whether South Korea will procure more THAAD, or terminal high-altitude defense missile batteries, to defend against the North Korean missile threat, and how much it will deepen trilateral security coordination between Washington and Tokyo. I think moving forward on any of these issues will essentially roll back the previous administration's three no's policy, which basically tried to reassure Beijing by saying that South Korea would not join a US-led missile defense network, that it wouldn't form a trilateral military alliance with the United States and Japan, and that it would not deploy additional THAAD batteries. This was sort of a commitment that was given. It was much criticized inside South Korea, but nevertheless, these were sort of the assurances that were made by the previous government to Beijing. And so I think if Beijing perceives as the new administration rolling these back, there could be trouble brewing. Beijing has continually warned Seoul, in fact, that it should tread carefully on these issues, and it's insisted that these sorts of developments in its backyard are unacceptable because they infringe on China's own security interests. And so in 2016, I'm sure many could recall, after South Korea decided to deploy US THAAD batteries to the peninsula following North Korea's fourth nuclear test and a barrage of missile tests by Pyongyang, China lashed out economically by retaliating on South Korean retail, tourism, and entertainment industries, which really relied heavily on the Chinese domestic market. I think ultimately Beijing's actions were counterproductive because it alienated the South Korean public. It went too far, and it basically threw cold water on the bilateral relationship between Seoul and Beijing that had been warming under the Park Geun-hye administration. And I think the fact that South Korean industries that were hurt during this time, the fact that they didn't really recover, has just further hardened views among South Koreans and the public that towing Beijing's line doesn't pay dividends. That's kind of the lesson that was learned. And I think this ultimately contributed to the foreign policy orientation of the Yoon administration and sort of where many are in Korea today. Having said that, it's not hard to imagine Beijing choosing to turn the economic screws again. And while I don't think that this will deter South Korean leaders or citizens from supporting measures that they believe directly impact South Korea's national security, it could give pause or reluctance to do more in the regional and global arenas on issues like Taiwan or democracy promotion, given the fact that there are a lot of domestic challenges that South Korea is dealing with, and there's a desire for leaders to address those first. And so, yeah, I think those are some of the thoughts. Let me just pause there, and we can go into Taiwan and other topics as we move on.
Well, thank you. I write ferocious notes because there's so many thoughts I have that I would love to follow up with. Overall, it's just clear that the new South Korean president has his work cut out for him, and certainly some really interesting insights about the South Korean public. Both becoming more wary and a really truly anti-China sentiment increasing after China's backlash and economic retaliation after the THAAD deployment in 2017. At the same time, though, unsure of what that means on the policy realm, of what policy is right for South Korea, given the competing interests. South Korea continues to be, China is its most important economic partner, all the while understanding that China that South Korea, as Yoon has said in the campaign, it's time for South Korea to be not necessarily anti-China in the region, but to be projecting more of its values and its principles in its foreign policies within the region. And even though it might not be declared an anti-China policy, China might very likely will read it that way. One other really interesting little thread to follow is that perhaps Beijing might be starting with a charm offensive. We saw with the inauguration that Xi Jinping sent an envoy who brought a letter that invited the new South Korean president to Beijing at a time of convenience. So
mutual
convenience, which is also an interesting thing given the COVID situation in China, when that might happen, another big question mark. Say this all to say we will never get through all of this in the hour, but these are the the folks to watch as we move forward in following your analyses. So thank you for that. Some really great insights on what the regional order shifts mean for South Korea. Okay, last round. I need to look at the time and see where we are. Oh, goodness, time is flying. All right, last round of questions. We can do this as sort of a speed round and then turn to audience. Okay, so for the third and final round, before we get to all of you, I want to see if we can generate some concrete policy recommendations for the Yoon and Biden administrations. As many of you are likely aware, the first summit meeting between the new President Yoon and President Biden will be on May 21st in Seoul, so very soon. And so first for Andrew on North Korea, a topic that we kind of can't get through the hour without diving into. This question has to do with policy recommendations on North Korea. As we know, North Korea's nuclear program has been the focal point for some multilateral initiatives in the past, like the six-party talks in particular. And clearly that initiative did not stop North Korea from continuing to develop its nuclear and missile programs. Various bilateral efforts over the years have also not been effective. And since the start of the year, as we're all well aware, North Korea has ramped up its missile testing significantly. So, Andrew, for you, with diplomacy having reached a dead end between the Biden administration and North Korea reaching out, North Korea not really responding, to what extent, I'm wondering, might new or old regional institutions help in moving the ball forward on North Korea's denuclearization? And at a bilateral level, what joint policy efforts, if any, do you think Yoon and Biden could introduce to respond to North Korea's provocations in the coming weeks and months, which we certainly expect will continue?
Yes, and as you asked that question, we're just reminded there was another recent missile test from North Korea, its 16th round. So it's not a problem or issue that's going to go away. But it's a difficult response when you talk about regional institutions and addressing North Korea, in part because North Korea itself is not really engaged with these institutions. The only institution that they're a part of is the ASEAN Regional Forum, and they occasionally discuss North Korea issues there, but there's no teeth, so there isn't really much that the ASEAN Regional Forum can do. And then, of course, there was the six-party talks framework, and there may be former diplomats that are listening or in the room that may reminisce about the good old days of when it looked like there was maybe some positive inertia in resolving the North Korea nuclear crisis, but because of the situation with Russia, China too, but really because of Russia, it's hard to get that multilateral framework going. And then lastly, the UN would be, the UN Security Council would be the appropriate place. But Russia is, if there's a seventh nuclear test, if North Korea conducts a seventh nuclear test, Russia is not going to agree to more sanctions at this point, or China for that matter. So we've kind of run out of options on the multilateral front, in part because there aren't really any institutions that North Korea engages with, and also because North Korea itself really wants to deal with the United States more than anyone else. And I know there's been some movement. There have been some discussions with the Chinese envoy to North Korea, visiting Washington a couple months ago, or I think last month, and then visiting South Korea more recently. But to be honest, we're sort of stuck. But in terms of what the UN administration can do, they've talked about defense and deterrence a lot. That's the new mantra for this government, and I think they do see eye to eye with the Biden administration. So they want to beefing up the defense and deterrence. There's probably going to be more resumption of joint training exercises with the U.S. and South Korea. They're probably going to invest in more capabilities, but they haven't given up on the engagement piece, on leaving that door open. And that was something that Yoon had mentioned in his inauguration address. I think he made a much bigger deal about this point than what he had in the campaign. And so if we see something like a crisis, I really think we have to wait for, hopefully not a nuclear crisis, but some kind of outside shock that can help get the momentum going. I'm very skeptical that North Korea will want to give up its nuclear weapons, but at least to come back to the table. And so we've also heard reports this morning that North Korea admitted to its first case ever of COVID. And so we don't know what that will spell for the country, but perhaps that might be an opening where they may want vaccine. They may want to think about the vaccine supplies that were offered to them again, or they may want to talk about humanitarian assistance, and maybe that can get the ball rolling again. And that's something that I think President Yoon and President Biden should think about some sort of contingency plan and come up with some kind of potential policy responses should North Korea ask for vaccines or further humanitarian assistance.
Great. So, not great. Thank you.
And not great that there's Omicron spreading.
Not a lot great
but
about
perhaps...
any of that. But helpful. I mean, you're making me smarter with all your comments. Just thinking about the multilateral prospects. Really not being many. Really interesting kind of way to think through that, and how. Perhaps it's quite worrying, this Omicron case in North Korea, knowing the state of no vaccines and no immunity, really potentially horrific situation there. But how that might be an opening, not to make it kind of really a leverage point necessarily, but an opening for engagement. So thank you for those thoughts on this also very critical and fast-moving issue within the region. Okay, so very quickly to Patricia for some policy thoughts, policy recommendations possibly, and then turn to the audience. A lot of great questions coming in as well from our virtual participants. Patricia, many analysts anticipate, and this is another big one, many analysts anticipate that Presidents Yoon and Biden will seek to endorse, to build upon the May 2021 U.S. ROK leaders' joint statement between Presidents Biden and the former President Moon of South Korea. I'm interested to hear your thoughts with regard to that statement on one element in particular that garnered a lot of attention from China. And that was the mention of, and I'll quote here, the importance of preserving peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. So given the intensification of the U.S. China competition in the months since the last U.S. ROK summit, how do you think the two leaders in the U.S. and South Korea together should handle issues like Taiwan, and more broadly perhaps? To what degree do you think Seoul should be more forward-leaning and actively supporting security initiatives in the region beyond the Korean Peninsula?
Sure. So lots to unpack there, and I'll try to get through it quickly. So first of all, I think the dramatic shift in the military balance in the Taiwan Strait in China's favor in recent years, and China's increasing use of coercion vis-a-vis Taiwan, has really raised the question about what more the U.S. and its allies, including South Korea, could do to ensure that Taiwan's future isn't determined through coercion. And I think Russia's brazen invasion of Ukraine has added greater urgency to conversations about what are Beijing's intentions and how do we prevent something similar from happening in the Asian region. And of course, there's also the questions about what lessons is Beijing drawing from the current crisis. I think it's too early to say with absolute confidence, these are the lessons that Beijing is drawing, but I think it'll depend on how the war plays out and how it ends and whether the unprecedented unity we've seen on sanctions lasts. But nevertheless, I think, it's important for the United States and its allies to continue to think about how do you deter China so that it understands that the diplomatic, economic, and military costs of annexing Taiwan would vastly outweigh any benefits. And while at the same time reassuring Chinese leaders and the Chinese public that the United States and its allies are not seeking to exploit the Taiwan card to try to contain China, that they want to maintain stable relations with Beijing, that we're not trying to prejudge the future relationship between the people of Taiwan and the people of China, and that's ultimately something that they need to settle down the road peacefully. And so I think the Biden administration has worked really hard to rally allies to express a collective commitment to uphold peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait and to demonstrate that this isn't simply about U.S. Taiwan issues, but really that the broader global community has a stake in stability in the region. And Katrin, you mentioned the May 2021 U.S. ROK leaders joint statement between Presidents Biden and former President Moon that affirmed Seoul and Washington have an interest in peace in the Taiwan Strait. I think this statement was very much in the right step, and now it's really incumbent upon the two allies to think about how do we operationalize this express commitment? What needs to be done to enhance military coordination? What roles will each state play in various contingency scenarios? And at the same time, I think it's also very important for the United States, South Korea, and other allies to think about how do we enhance risk reduction and crisis management mechanisms with Beijing. So how do we have substantive and regular exchanges that can help clarify mutual expectations to sort of set red lines and manage differences? And how do we make sure that crisis management mechanisms are in place and operational so that if there is some kind of contingency, that we don't have that, we don't let that make us stumble into a war, which would really be catastrophic for the United States, for China, for South Korea, and everyone really out in the region. And so I think there's a lot of work to be done. The statement is just one step, but it really needs to be fleshed out. And it's not just about deterrence, but there's also the reassurance piece that I think the two allies really need to be thinking about.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. This, before pivoting to audience questions, everyone's minds are very understandably focused on Russia, Ukraine, but there's also this big question of what that means for Asia, and particularly China, Taiwan, and potentially, what Asia means for the world. This all kind of connects at this broader international order level that we're kind of really brought to through the Russia-Ukraine piece, how it challenged liberal international norms and how that trickles immediately over to Asia. So just general thoughts on how kind of regional orders and kind of dynamics within them, dynamics between them are also becoming quite important. On Patricia's comments, how critical it is that we can have these broad statements, but how critical policy steps will be really in managing these issues, and how critical these relationships will be, of course, the U.S. ROK alliance being a really important one in managing things like hopefully not, but potential contingency in Taiwan. So thank you both so much for those very, I know there were really packed questions, and you gave more than packed answers. I do want to turn to some audience questions. Jonathan, would you like to start with a live question, or yeah, just for all of you so patiently listening and waiting?
So raise your hand if you have a question. We'll take two at a time, and we can bring the mic to the front. So Michael, yeah, and then
Okay. Hello, can you hear me? Okay, it's working. Hi, my name is Kushbu, and my question is to both of you. We are talking about regional institutions, but South Korea recently joined the cybersecurity unit of NATO, and there is an invitation for South Korea and Japan to attend the Madrid summit, NATO summit. If South Korea decides to accept that invitation, we all expect China to get really angry. But how do you think it will further implicate the relations between North Korea and South Korea? Because we are only focusing on China, that it will anger China, but it could also be threatening to South Korea to North Korea if South Korea is getting more intimate towards NATO. Should South Korea actually accept that invitation, A, and if it does, how will it impact things between, on the Korean peninsula? My second question is, when Donald Trump was in power, he was very critical of South Korea. And there are talks about him running for presidency again, and there is a huge chance that he will be coming back. So how does Yoon government, the new government in South Korea, plans to, tackle with that change when it happens? And does whatever Biden administration promises South Korea, does it inspire any confidence, given there's a good chance that Donald Trump is coming back as president? Thank you.
Thank you. Two great questions. One more from the audience, and then I'll turn it back to you.
So, I just have a whole bunch of thoughts that you can choose to ignore or answer. But like the first one, you mentioned the transition from hub and spoke to multilateral institutions. Maybe someone can comment about that. It's been said that hub and spoke was actually the U.S. preference because it could be the senior partner in the bilateral relationships. But we're in multilateral institutions. It's just one of many and could be constrained in action and in policy by just being one member in a multilateral institution. So that it was maybe hub and spoke was actually the U.S. preference for action in that. Also, we briefly mentioned about China's reaction to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but India has been very reluctant to be critical about Russia's and they're a member of the Quad, which is more has more impact on what U.S. policy has to be, because we have to deal with India in the Quad. And also about South Korea's reluctance to join multilateral institutions is, liberal politics in the domestic politics in South Korea. The liberal politics were very wary about being drawn into any U.S. initiatives in the region because liberal politics, and also about the mention about North Korea and vaccines and stuff. It's been reported that they've refused offers of Chinese vaccines and that they've expressed very specific preference on what vaccines they would accept. They want specifically an RNA-developed vaccine, not any other ones, because they feel that they're better. But maybe RNA vaccines would be very difficult to provide to them in a timely basis. So maybe if someone can make some comment about that too.
They want made in USA vaccines.
Yeah. And okay, so this is just a lot to thought about. People you can choose to comment or not on anything. Sorry.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Should we? Yeah. Thank you so much.
Sure. That's a great question on the NATO front. There's been a lot of discussions in Washington about the Indo Pacific and transatlantic alliances, and South Korea has been invited to come to Madrid, and the foreign minister of South Korea attended a NATO meeting, I believe beginning of April, which was the first ever. And we're going to see more connections between transatlantic and trans-Pacific partnerships. And I can't speak for the Yoon government, but I wouldn't be surprised if he does, if South Koreans do attend in Madrid, because we're seeing a lot of these problems, strategic issues intertwined. And it comes with this February 4th statement between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin. I think that has really opened the door for policymakers in Asia to think about these connections. Now, what implications that'll have on North Korea, I don't think it will have a direct impact on the North Korea bit. I think, if anything, it'll just add ammunition to North Korea's rhetoric that the U.S. and their imperial lackeys are trying to crush, countries like North Korea, and certainly China. I think is going to have more of a reaction. I think if it sees South Korea joining NATO, because they see the Quad as really another sort of NATO, and so what had happened with NATO expansion is what led to the war in Russia, and they'll use that to say this is what the U.S. is now trying to do to China. So it could be seen as escalatory on the Chinese front. So it may create tensions. And just very quickly on the hub and spokes, I think the U.S. Traditionally has always leaned on its bilateral alliance system, and the Clinton administration was really, when these new multilateral organizations were developing, was not keen on joining, because they thought that would compete with or undermine the strength of bilateral alliances. But that hasn't been the case. And so the book that Katrin mentioned is really about what I call a layered or overlapping institutions. It's about the hub and spokes being underneath, or central to, I think, the regional architecture. But the U.S. also understands that not every issue can be addressed by bilateral alliances. And so I think former Defense Secretary Ashton Carter used this phrase, principled security network. And I think that's the way the U.S. is thinking about these things, that there are these different networks that are created that can be useful for dealing with particular issues. And U.S. bilateral alliances are part of that network, an important part, but not the only tool or instrument.
So there are a lot of interesting threads to pick up from the two questions. The one I wanted to pick up on was something that Andrew talked about, which is this really the galvanizing of transatlantic and trans-Pacific ties, and how there's just so much. There's been a real wake-up call in Europe, obviously, with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and I think this has led to more interest in Europe on working with the United States, also in the Indo Pacific. And so I've personally gotten a lot more calls from European diplomats who want to know more about where the U.S. China competition in the Indo Pacific is going, or what can Europe do to contribute more to peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. I mean, I think it's just really galvanized a lot of thinking this way, that where in the past there might have been more distance, I think. And also in Asia as well, I mean, in Japan, also South Korea, there's just so much more interest in how do we prepare for contingencies down the line. So it's a natural reaction to, I think, where the world is going, with U.S.-China competition heating up and people trying to understand how do we navigate this geopolitical divide. On India, it's really interesting. So India has also been very much quiet, and which doesn't really align with it being a member of the Quad and so on the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And it was so interesting to see that Foreign Minister Wang Yi chose to go to New Delhi when President Biden was going to Europe to make his tour. And I think it's indicative of China sort of looking around and seeing where can we find so-called non-aligned states or third world states to band together to push back on Western encirclement and hegemony. I think China has seen India as a partner in the past, although I think Indian views of China have really deteriorated after their border standoff, and India is not really playing in that lane. But it's really interesting. If you look at the China-Russia joint statement, there's they allude to cultivating deeper ties with India and within the BRICS, so the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa framework, and really kind of sort of creating this anti-Western or alternative to Western force of powers. And so that'll be really interesting to watch those dynamics, although I don't think India is a willing partner in any of this.
Well, great. If we have time, thank you for those great answers and for the great questions. For time, I can do one of the incoming. I'm going to read everyone's names who sent in questions, but I apologize that we won't be able to get to all of them. I'm choosing a question that focuses on kind of internal domestic issues within South Korea to kind of handle that. But before I get to those, I want to thank Stephen Sir, again, Jeffrey Tao, Jenny Joy, Charles Willow, Aram Her, whose question I'm about to read, Edward Baker, again, Jenny Joy, for your participation and the great questions that you have sent in. Okay, so the question that I'm going to kind of pose to both of you, it's two on internal dynamics. One is for Aram Her, a good friend of the Korea Society from University of Missouri. Aram asks, what do you see as the primary threat to South Korea's position as a leading regional democracy and alliance partner to the U.S., and how does the new Yoon administration affect that? That's the first part. Second, on kind of internal social dynamics within South Korea, Jenny Joy from the Catholic Institute of Northeast Asia Peace. Jenny asks, despite President Yoon's strong verbal support for the alliance, are there social factors that will constrain him to walk a third path due to South Korea's interdependence with the Chinese economy? So,
Sure. Maybe I'll take the first one. You can take
Yeah,
the
go.
second one. So to Professor Her's question, and full disclosure, we've actually written on this topic as well too, but I think she's getting me to think further about what happens next. In terms of democracy, we saw the campaign. It was ugly. It was like a blood sport. There's a lot of mudslinging. They got the wives involved, and everyone's recognizing that polarization is becoming a bigger problem in South Korea's democratic space. That being said, what was amazing was the election was called. The gap, it was so close that it was less than 1% of a difference in terms of the votes. I think it was 0.8%. If that happens in the U.S., you can be sure that the losing party is going to demand a recall, that they're going to be kicking and screaming to the end, that you can't just end it if it's less than 1%. But within 24 hours, the ruling party at the time conceded to that. Lee Jae-myung conceded, and that was pretty amazing. That the institutions are still in place, and Korean politicians and the electorate respect that. And I think back about Park Geun-hye's impeachment in 2017 or 2016, 2017. This was unprecedented, and no one really knew what to happen next. Having special elections and going through the court process of the impeachment, this was new territory. So even though things were really crazy and people were saying that there's all this stress on democracy, the Koreans respected the political the democratic institutions that were there. So that in some ways gives me faith or hope in Korean democracy, even though we see polarization growing, and it's of course undergirded by other tensions along generational divides, gender divides as well too. So the Yoon government, we'll have to see how he proceeds. He's already made decisions that were controversial, like leaving the president or moving the presidential office to the Ministry of National Defense, and it looks like he's maybe doing these things unilaterally. I would say that he really needs to try to at least reach out to the other side before making these decisions. I know there's no specific policy, but in terms of his actions or his words, he has this platform that everyone sees and watches. So I think he has to be mindful of that. And he did say in his inauguration speech that he's a president for all of Koreans, that he wants to be able to work to heal some of these divides and wounds. So those are good words, but we really have to see how he acts, how he chooses and appoints people. I think these are important steps that he can take early on in his presidency to set the right tone, because he's already off to a rocky start with lower opinion polls than the outgoing president at the time.
So I guess building on that theme, sort of the internal challenges that South Korea faces. So it was really interesting to see President Yoon make this strong case in his inaugural speech that advancing democracy and liberty at home, you can't untie that with doing that in the international arena. It's really part of the same goal, and to really make the case that therefore South Korea needs to take on a bigger role in its neighborhood and beyond. And it'll be interesting to see how much this resonates with the South Korean public, and whether they're willing to take on a more activist foreign policy, as I talked about earlier in my comments. And how much do South Koreans really see Taiwan as an immediate issue that impacts their security? I'm not really sure if there's a clear, I think people feel very disappointed with the way things have, unfolded in Hong Kong or in Taiwan. But I don't know if they really see that as a South Korean problem per se. And so really, it'll be really interesting to watch how far can the new administration go in sort of this democracy, defense of democracy's agenda. That I think many countries like Japan, the United States have begun emphasizing more, and that the Union administration has said we want to participate in as well. But it'll be interesting to see how much legs it has, given all of these domestic challenges that it's facing at home.
Well, great. Thank you, for these insights on internal dynamics. I think we've gone past time. I do want to give Andrew and Patricia an opportunity for any closing thoughts, any changes in the region we didn't bring up, any policy recommendations you'd like to throw out there on any topic before we wrap up.
I would just say now is the time to really watch South Korea because of this idea that they want to engage and become more active on the Indo Pacific, that they want to improve ties with Japan. We are going to see a little bit of a shift, and so I would just say to pay attention to what South Korea does on the regional and global stage.
Great.
Well, I think we covered so much ground, and I realize we're much over time. And so I just want to thank the audience for sticking with us past the hour. This was just a really great conversation. Thank you for your moderating, Katrin, and thank you again for the Korea Society for hosting us.
Thank you both again. I know I learned a lot, so thank you to the audience as well. Thanks for joining us.